Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining the Colorado Sun for our event tonight on clearing Colorado's air. We also consider it bold counter programming to the Nuggets game, which doesn't start until 6:30. So you have at least a full half hour. We expect you to stick with us. We can also update the score every 10 minutes or so for the second half hour if it's important to people, or if you're on a digital video recorder and don't want to alert ahead of that time. Group of guests with us tonight and a lot of reader questions to go over that have been sent as we talk about Colorado's air pollution challenges and that many nationally consider to be pretty bold steps to start clearing and changing the way industry and transportation in Colorado. So we have Michael Ogletree, who is the head of the state's Public Health Department Air Pollution Control Division. So he's in charge of permitting, carrying out policy, greenhouse gas, and local air pollution. He is a similar position previously as an air pollution in the city of Denver. And among the things he did with Denver was some of the public elementary schools to try to get monitors in those schools to follow air pollution and work on asthma problems in central Denver. We also Patricia Garcia-Nelson, who lives in Weld County. She is the transition advocate for Colorado GreenLatinos. In 2020, was the sole parent plaintiff against the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission over their approval of a permit for a 24-well oil and gas site less than 700 feet from the playground of her son's school. And since then, she has become an activist and an expert in monitoring of potentially toxic oil and gas pollution and other pollution throughout the state. We also have with us tonight Jennifer Biever, who is a director at the law firm of William Ferguson and is American Petroleum Institute, Colorado, which is one of the two large oil and gas groups in Colorado, and at the forefront of environmental permitting and other regulatory issues affecting energy and other extractive industries. She is one of the leading legal experts on methane emissions from the oil and gas industry and efforts being involved in Colorado's recent methane rulemakings. And our three panelists have often encountered each other at the Air Quality Control Commission and other forums. Michael is fresh off Air Commission meetings today, where they made new policy that he can tell us about. And are planning more policies in the future. Michael, I think we could start off with you as we talk about air pollution and the ozone season, which we are already in as of May 1st. Obviously, Colorado has an ozone problem. The EPA has declared us in severe violation of their on the Front Range and the 9 front that make up that district. And a lot of people would like to know what we are doing right now in the short term and what the Air Quality Control Commission in the longer term to try to start limiting that ozone. If you could talk a little bit about how you all are anticipating the ozone season and what some of the short-term and near-term policy changes are that might give us some relief.
Thanks, Michael. And thanks to Patricia and Jennifer as well. It's good seeing you yesterday at the Air Quality Control Commission. Ozone is a problem here along the Front Range. I think some of the big things we're doing here in the short term, we're looking at zero emissions trucks to help reduce some of those precursors from vehicles. We're also looking at 2 grant programs where we're looking at zero emissions. We're looking at funding zero emission school buses, as well as low and zero emission fleets. We've also made changes more recently to our modeling guidelines such that we have lower thresholds for modeling within permitting to reduce nitrogen oxide as well as sulfur dioxide. This last legislative session, we've also been working with Governor Polis to get additional funding to support some of the changes as a result of the reclassification. So we've been hiring very quickly. We've added over 130 people in the last 12 months and still have about 100 more to go so we can be fully staffed and ready to make sure we can implement the strongest rules possible.
Does the health department believe that ozone is currently impacting some people's health in Colorado, and people keep track of the current ozone season day to day? What would you recommend people look at when they're worried about themselves or their kids, other ones that may be.
Yeah, we know that ozone is, a lung irritant, and it does impact some of those, in particular, vulnerable communities within Colorado. When we're looking at how best to track it, we do put out ozone alerts on a daily basis. We actually put them out in front of an actual ozone day. We look at meteorological factors and try to anticipate in advance of those days. So we do have ozone alerts that come out the night before. That's one way you can track it. You could sign up for those on our website. You can also look at EPA has a website that shows, it's called EPA has a website, and you can kind of track where ozone is, and what they use there is a different type of methodology, but also linked to health, where you can actually look at more real-time ozone concentrations and make sure that you're taking the protections you need.
Okay. Patricia, I wanted to go to you next to talk about people that you represent and advocate for, and you talk about how you feel ozone in particular, but also other pollution, if you would like to mention it, affect them on a day-to-day basis, and what you've got you launched in career of activism and expertise on this subject. What do you see day to day? And we can talk from there about what you feel others should be doing to do more about it.
First, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really an honor to industry leaders and agency leaders. Thank you guys also. And seeing, I can't even go to the nail salon to get my nails done without randomly, whose child also happens to go to my school, who's losing tons and tons of weight. Nobody knows what's happening. Children with asthma. My neighbor across the street was so happy that her son was now going to high school because she put in the wells. He's been there the whole time. His asthma cases have increased. There's a lot of disheartened asking us if we can help. Especially right now, we have all this funding coming in. It's like the prime places where we're going to put all of the experimental, all of these potentially hazardous and even more dangerous industries all across the board. Where we're already having a tough time. So that is what we're experiencing day to day. With the government, with agencies, and yet we really haven't seen very little to no relief.
But Patricia, from Weld County, where you are as well, there are quite a few people who are employed in the oil and gas industry and in transportation industry that relies on fossil fuels. And are you concerned at all that too much regulation of oil and gas industry and fossil fuels will and hurt employment and the
I am about family members that are employed by this industry, and I'm not just worried about their economic future. I'm worried about the impacts that working in this industry has on their health. Several oil and gas workers who had to leave because they got too sick to continue working. Also, at the end of the day, we know that this is a finite resource. And so not only am I concerned for the future of people that are working in this industry now, I'm concerned about what's going to happen when all of the oil and gas operations, like there's no more room for anything else or it runs out. Halliburton had been, it was when they were extraction oil and gas, they posted on their Facebook that they have a good 5 to 10 years left in Weld County. And what we don't think about are the long-term effects. These installations are not just there while they're producing heavily for the first 2 to 3 years, up exponentially, and that's why they have to continue. And for the effects that it's having on us right now, but then also there is no more industry. we need to be proactive, not reactive. And as far as the economic impacts to this industry, Michael, you and I and everybody else has heard these talking points for decades. We've passed, yes, we have progress, not enough in my opinion, but we've been making enough progress where all of these regulations that the industry was crying wolf about, the industry is still alive and well. They're still boasting record-breaking profits. And so the fact that we're trying to get them to comply with certain regulations so that we can reach attainment for air quality, in my mind, what that's saying is that they simply can't operate in accordance with the law. And that does not sound like a good neighbor to me.
Jennifer, the phrase alive and well for the industry that you represent, obviously there's a lot of profits. There are some, but the industry contention is that they have done quite a bit to join in Colorado regulation that better air quality. Do you want to talk about the things that you think are most important the industry has done, and whether there are ideas out there that you still oppose and think?
Yeah, thank you. So the industry's done a lot. I mean, in the last, decade and a half that I've been working on this, we've had probably 10 rulemakings at the Air Quality Control Commission, and they've increasingly become more and more stringent. And frankly, what those have done is put us as the most stringent state in the country with respect to oil and gas regulations. So, we started with, storage tanks, and we've moved to kind of a whole host of different kinds of regulations on virtually every kind of piece of main equipment you see at an oil and gas facility. And in fact, our regulations have been the sort of model for EPA's regulations at a national level. They look to what Colorado is doing because we've been at the forefront of that. So there's been a lot of that going on. And what I would say is that as well in the last, decade of that, there's been a lot of that happening in collaboration with many environmental groups and local governments. We don't always see eye to eye, but a lot of times we spend a lot of time trying to figure out where we can agree. I think one of the difficult things about being the regulated industry is when we come to a rulemaking, people hear only the things that we're saying we want changed or that we would like to be different. And oftentimes there's not as much focus on what we actually support, which increasingly is a significant portion of the rules that the division is proposing. And we work with the division and other stakeholders to try and narrow those differences and collaborate to come to the table with additional regulations. And so I think that has become a model that industry has really been working towards. But there does come a time when there simply isn't a ton of sort of command and control regulations that are really left on the table. That's one of the reasons, one of the more recent rulemakings in December of 2021, the division adopted and industry supported what we call the intensity rulemaking, which is a rulemaking that really allows industry the flexibility to find emissions. And these are greenhouse gas emissions, but also in many cases, they have reductions of VOCs, because when you reduce methane, you reduce volatile organic compounds, and to find ways within their assets to find the best reductions, where you're going to get the most reductions for the best cost, but also for that operator's sort of portfolio. And so I think that, there continue to be, you asked Director Ogletree earlier, like, what are some of the things that are going on with ozone? There continue to be a number of stakeholder processes for oil and gas going on right now. The division is currently looking at pre-production drilling and fracking emissions reductions. They're also looking at small engine reductions for engines that might be used that are run on diesel and natural gas at oil and gas facilities. And then the RAC, the Regional Air Quality Council, is looking at kind of several committees to evaluate whether there should be additional reductions on equipment such as what they call pneumatics, intermittent emissions that come when you have to do maintenance events, as well as combustion emissions. So there's a lot that's continuing to go on that industry is really sitting at the table for, but also really trying to make sure that we do this in the most strategic way possible.
And Jennifer, the other thing that's going to be coming up, oil and gas industry's control, but something that will certainly affect them. The Regional Air Quality Council is likely by the end of this to make changes to what lawn equipment or other to try to limit oil and gas lawn equipment and start replacing it and start making a requirement. Michael, do you feel that like that there is still an opportunity for some near-term that might get us in line with the EPA requirements for state plan?
I think, we've done a lot of changes in, the past couple of years. I think we've had about 19 rulemakings since 2019, if not more. But there is always opportunities. I think, from some of these off-road engines, as you mentioned, in particular from lawn and garden, I think there is opportunities to make some of those changes to reduce some of those precursors that lead to those higher levels of ozones during seasons like we're in now.
Patricia, do you feel that rules like the intensity rulemaking or sort of high concept regulations that the oil and gas industry has said Colorado is a leader wide, do you buy that? Do you think that we are a leader in regulation? And sorry, Patricia, you're on mute right now.
It's 2023. We're still stuck with the buttons. But in terms of what we have done as a state, I will say that Colorado is a leader in this industry, and these innovative policies and everything that we're passing. I don't feel like it goes far enough. I have about going on, I don't know, since 2018, so 5 that the wells behind Sun School have been polluting the area and they're still operational. The intensity standard, one of the most important factors of that intensity standard would be that there would be that there needs to be direct measurement. Like, you can't figure the intensity standard without direct measurement. And this is something that both agency and industry fight us on all the time. It's gotten to the point where community members, including myself, have taken it upon ourselves to create community air monitoring programs. And I understand that maybe there is a capacity at agencies, whether it's with people or funding, but at the same time, we have the mechanisms and we could easily charge industry to facilitate that. And all the great things that the industry has done that Jennifer's talking about, I've been in rulemakings both at a local level, a state level, and a federal level, where again, the same talking points that we hear from the agency time and time again is that all of these regulations are going to crush the industry, but then at the same time, they're still talking about their record profits. And so I don't understand how they continue to tell us that they're going to be good neighbors when we're continuously being polluted. There's zero accountability. The enforcement that they get is a letter saying, hey, you've been polluting for too long, fix it. There's places like Suncor, there's so many pipeline disasters. And as I'm working and learning more and more, I'm learning that the reporting, especially even when we get to a broader federal level, is even less stringent at some time. So I'm wondering, is the picture worse than the actual reality? And it should members who are already burdened have been doing this for going on 6 years. And a lot of the work I did for free. I knew in my heart that we had to keep going and we had to keep fighting for nobody. And so at the end of the day, there is still so much work to be done. We've been talking about our experiences, and again, it just seems like there's more and more loopholes created for the industry. I mean, at this point, with the rulemaking at the AQCC, we're grouping groups of disproportionately impacted communities. 100 of the second class, or 594 of the second class, out of 107 or 709, was it, Michael? Communities total that fall into this DIC category. Almost all of them are DIC communities. And so we're having regulations where I feel the industry has had a big hand in picking and choosing what we're actually going to do. And they do push a lot on our agencies, and it simply isn't fair.
disproportionate impact, which more important things happen with. Can explain more of that to us. I want to give Jennifer the chance to talk. Patricia said, in terms of whether things are enforced, whether the industry continues to fight more regulation and profitable, appears to be thriving even as we add regulation. What is the hindrance to can do even more faster to cut ozone?
So, I mean, let me take the sort of monitoring and the direct measurement and the verification kind of piece first. So,
Okay.
just as an initial piece in terms of the kind of monitoring, which is a little bit different than direct measurement for emissions that are part of the intensity rule. In 2020, the Air Quality Control Commission, with support from industry, adopted continuous emissions monitoring that occurs around facilities. Beginning, you have to take baseline information before you begin pre-production. So before you begin drilling and fracturing, and then you have to take time, about 6 months of measurements after that. You have to report that information monthly. You have to look at kind of if certain triggers are hit, you have to go out and take corrective action. And the division has been reporting out that information to the AQCC every year since we've started. And then in today's rulemaking, those provisions got extended for communities that are in defined by the division as cumulatively impacted communities, which is over the 80th percentile in what's called EnviroScreen. And so there are continuous monitoring that has started even well before sort of we started this dialogue today and with the rulemaking that happened today. With respect to the measurement, I would say that back in 2017, I think it was, we developed a stakeholder process. We called it SHARE, the statewide hydrocarbon emissions reductions process. And it was one where all of industry, local governments, the division came together, and we met for over a year. And we met usually monthly and sometimes more frequently. And many things came out of that. And I would disagree with the notion that industry is sort of fighting and looking for every loophole. Like, industry continues to come to the table frequently. And one of the examples was, out of that SHARE process, industry proposed a robust emissions inventory where they would report that inventory. And it is the most robust that I know of in the country. It is, to Patricia's point, probably more robust and captures more refined equipment than the EPA inventory does. And that was sponsored and proposed by industry because we do believe that the data is important and the science is important. And then upcoming in July of this year, they have kicked off the process for what is the verification portion of the intensity rule. And that is going to require direct measurement of facilities. And the process is being evaluated on what that means. As you can imagine, it's kind of cutting edge. There's a lot of variation in technologies, but that rulemaking is going to happen in July. And there's going to be a lot of additional information and process around how to ensure and give comfort that the emissions that are being reported are what they say they are.
Michael, I was hoping you could take on some of the questions that were raised about both monitoring and enforcement, because I know enforcement is one of the things you want to the state certain cases that are egregious. Talk about that. In terms of monitoring, we have a reader question asking, and it's a theme that some of our readers have asked. Regulations first. Monitoring is part of. Patricia mentioned that there are communities that have taken on monitoring on their own. And I know they would like to, and sometimes do, share that information with the state health department. Is the state health department accepting that data and that information as part of its overall look at air pollution on the Front Range? Patricia shaking her head. So I guess the question is, if not, why not?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. As you know, monitoring is near and dear to my heart. Did a lot of that at the city and county of Denver, really looking at monitoring near and around Suncor. With regard to taking into account the information that communities are collecting, we absolutely do. And proof of that is in the last couple of weeks, we've actually looked at the Cultivando data that they've been collecting and used that to better inform how we communicate about what's going on in that area. We also look at monitoring that's going on in different areas. For example, in Boulder, when they put out the sensor network after the Marshall Fire to look at those different measurements, we look at all of that and take that into account as we, make decisions about what we're doing and how we pass regulations. I would add that monitoring can be challenging in some cases, right? So for the intensity rulemaking, for example, direct measurement isn't a feasible way to capture all of the emissions that are coming off from these facilities, right? You can't just measure everything. You can try, but it's challenging because you can't have point source measurements or even open path measurements that capture everything around an entire facility. So in the intensity rule, what we're looking at is a multi-pronged approach where we look at different ways to as best capture all of the emissions that are being released from those sources, including when appropriate, direct measurement. So I'll leave it at that. And
Michael,
Patricia,
can I just
you've been
respond? No, go ahead.
and I am going to get to Patricia too, because she was shaking her head a lot. So go ahead, Jennifer.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd
So,
like to
Patricia-
hear what you have to say about that.
I was just going to say, I do think that in terms of monitoring and equating that with enforcement, I think that's what we're talking about here is monitoring in the community of ambient air concentrations, which is information that is then, the division, again, this rulemaking that was just finalized today is going to collect additional information on that, require additional monitoring, both by the air quality enterprise as well as the sources if they are meeting certain criteria. And I think that I just wanted to sort of correct what I think is a little bit, I don't believe that monitoring and enforcement are sort of the same thing. And so I think that the monitoring, while it is important and it informs the data, there are very distinct purposes there.
Okay, thanks. Patricia, when I was talking about, and Jennifer were talking about sharing information, you were shaking your head vigorously. You apparently don't think that the health department is accepting.
No.
More about that.
Well, where should we start? Let's start with my personal experience with the agency. I have had representatives chuckle at my concerns, talking about, well, there's cigarette smoke and there's benzene in the gasoline. And it's like, exactly. To smoke, children aren't allowed to pump gas for a reason, right? And then we have all but explicitly been told that our data is worthless. We are using technology comparable or better than what's been provided by the state. We have, me not directly, but I've heard multiple stories of our partners being bullied by the agency. And, there's just been flat out multiple moments of just disrespect, right? And then when we talk about the need for monitoring, what I kept getting told is we can't shut down the wells behind your child's school because we have no proof that there's emissions and pollutions. Then we had the incident in 2019 where there was a leak, right? For days and days and days, parents were notified 20 days after the incident. And then we have also, and then when we talk about monitoring in communities, I'm not just doing this on my own. I have had personal calls from people at CDPHE saying, hey, we had the emission incident near your son's school. It was close enough that we felt we needed to tell you. So this is happening constantly over and over and over again. It's gone to the point where the agency said we can't do anything because we don't have proof. Same with the industry. Now we're getting monitors in our communities, and we have tangible proof that harm is coming to our communities. And the rulemakings that are coming out from the agency are honestly falling so short of 1266, was the Environmental Justice Act, which was put into place to protect communities that have been historically disproportionately impacted. And all of these rules continue to have loop polluting. Like, when are we actually going to take action and shut down that are constantly harming our communities? Anybody tell me one benefit that pollution has for our communities? Just give me one benefit. One benefit for our communities.
Because we have talked about the cultivando data in particular, and in particular in relation to some had in April. Suncor, if people don't know, is the one large refinery in Colorado that's and has had a number of different leak incidents and air pollution water in the last few years. And the state monitors it more carefully. There are incidents where Cultivando had information, and you've tried to explain how the state can or can't use Cultivando's information. And so tell us more about how that works, and the community data can be useful to the state.
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned before, we did use that Cultivando data in the past two Suncor incidences, and they're actually referenced in our press releases that we put out. So it's something that we do. We are looking at that data as well as other networks that are in that area, including the city and county of Denver. CDOT has a network there. And so we do take a look at all of that information because we know that that information is valid and is useful, right? We actually audit the monitoring for Cultivando. We've done that within the past month to make sure that that is accurate. We've also had co-locations with our reference sites. So we absolutely trust the data that's being collected and use it as appropriate, especially when it's coming to trying to inform the community about what's going on there.
And you talked a little bit about how the difference between being able to do things in real time, but also having to verify things before you warn the community and get information out there. And in some cases, there has been a gap where you had to spend the day trying to verify information. How can the public handle the information if they get warned at the end of the day that a leak started at the beginning of the day? What should they do with that?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. In that instance where we weren't able to get it out till later on in the day, while we were looking at the data that was being collected in the area, one of the instruments went down. So we were trying to figure out what was going on because it had elevated readings. We weren't sure why it went down. So we got in touch with that entity and tried to figure that out. And they thought it was something wrong with their instrument. And I was like, well, we don't think it is. So they validated the data. And when we were able to validate it with that entity, we were then able to put out the press release knowing that the data that had been collected during that time period was valid. So it can be challenging, right? And when we're talking about like nuances on how air is monitored, some of people are also asking us, well, why is their site collecting data and ours isn't? Well, that depends on meteorology. If we don't happen to be downwind, if our sites that are in and around the area don't happen to be downwind, they won't capture it, which is why we work with other entities and other people who are collecting data in the area where they have monitors where we may not have monitors. And we use that information to better inform how we educate the public or inform the public about what's going on in the area.
Okay. Jennifer, I was wondering if you could kind of address the bigger picture in terms of the things that Patricia is talking about. Do you feel that the industry understands now why residents are upset about oil and gas wells being located very close to communities or schools? Do you feel there's a better understanding of that? And the industry has opposed moving things farther back even than they are now? And can you talk a little bit about why you continue to oppose that?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think, in the mission change rulemakings that happened at the COGCC a couple of years ago, there was a lot of discussion as you talked about that setback distance, right? And that setback distance was sort of put into place based on a health study done by CDPH&E that was older, right? And frankly, didn't account for many of the reductions in the emissions reductions that the Air Quality Control Commission has since put into place. And frankly, many of the best management practices that operators are including in their permits at the COGCC or that the COGCC is mandating. And so, there was toxicologists that testified in there that, that data was sort of a worst case scenario. And so I think part of it is I do think industry believes in the data and the science, and we need to focus on the information that we have. And so, beyond that setback wasn't, we don't believe it was supported by the science. It is there now, and industry is complying with it. And, ultimately the permitting that goes on at the COGCC really looks at a lot of that. What's proximity to residential? There's a lot of, if you watch those hearings, there's a lot of information about what can you do? What are you doing to electrify if you can? What other types of best management practices are you doing? So this notion, and I understand that many operators go out into the communities to also like let people know that they're going to be, doing these, oil and gas development permits in the area. And so there's a lot of process around that. So I think to say that industry is ignoring kind of information, I just don't think it's true. I think that, they're looking at the information that's there. They're agreeing in many cases to collect additional information. And then we want to have a dialogue about what that information means. And I think that's the real critical piece, is that there's a lot of testimony and a lot of that happened yesterday about data and data points. And it really is critical to look at, like, you can't just take data and look at it out, and pick pieces of it. You have to try and really put it together. And this is something Director Ogletree is far more suited to talk about than I am. But look at how you put it together and understand what the real picture is. And I think by trying to talk about that, that doesn't mean that industry is sort of not open to and not interested in the data, but it means looking at it in the right manner.
Let's not take a slight to the side and pause and talk a little bit more about, which we've mentioned a few times, but we got to remember that not all of our listeners are steeped in that and follow it every day. And so I would just introduce Michael talking about what happened today at AQCC with the general observation that state and federal regulations in the last few years and laws passed by the legislature require that anything being done with transportation or with air permitting or with clean air and fossil fuel regulation takes into better account the potential disproportionate historic pollution and historic siting of different industry in communities that are lower income or have high proportions of people of color disproportionately impacted in the past, and requiring that any state agency that is, or federal agency that is regulating that, take that into account and do more in those cases. And so, Michael, you had mentioned that an important step was taken at AQC. More about that in that context.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd first like to just acknowledge that, these communities are disproportionately impacted and, have, real health impacts as a result of, historical racism. Today was a good step forward. We passed a rule that was specifically around modeling and monitoring in disproportionately impacted communities. So now sources in those communities will be required to create these environmental justice report summaries, very specifically identifying in that area those disproportionately impacted communities and their impact. It'll also include additional regulations around reasonable available control technologies, which would actually reduce emissions in those communities. There's also a mechanism in there for community air monitoring, where we would actually measure within the communities in and around some of these disproportionately impacted communities and sources in those communities to make sure that we're measuring the impact in those communities as we look to improve regulations. There's also a component in there about additional outreach and education about the impacts of air pollution to those communities. For me, it was a rulemaking I was very involved with and passionate about, and making sure that we have some of those strongest regulations, in particular in those disproportionately impacted communities.
Did you feel today's discussion was a step forward? Is that going in the right direction, and is it significant?
I'm not going to say that it was a big step, but progress is progress at this point. We are really disappointed that, so I was GreenLatinos was part of a community group that submitted us an alternative proposal. We lined out in detail the way that we wanted to see community air monitoring programs run. And there were a lot of changes that we wanted to see that we don't feel like we're taking into consideration when the final rule came out. But at the end of the day, again, we are going to be capturing the damage that's happening to our communities as it's happening. And again, what resources or what recourses do community members have? Like, is it going to be, are we going to be able to see any of the benefits of constant pollution in our bodies after 10 years, 15 years? Like, what's the point?
So, Michael,
Really frustrating as, sorry.
No, I was just going to ask Michael to respond to that in terms of, in addition to having to list what the environmental justice impacts might be as you're applying for a permit, what does the decision today allow the state to then do to say that's too much pollution, or you need to do more, or you need to spend more money on equipment that would control that? Are there some teeth in it?
Yeah, so that's where the RACT comes in. So there are RACT requirements, as I mentioned, that's reasonable available control technologies, which refers to equipment that is technologically and financially feasible for the pollution source to install. So those are, it's not a one size fits all. It depends on the type of source. So for us, like those types of requirements in disproportionately impacted communities are actual reductions and not just measurement.
Jennifer, did the industry take a position on the DI policy change? How will it affect oil and gas operations in Colorado?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, the industry supported many aspects of the division's policy and then had some concerns with many aspects of it. Specific to the oil and gas industry, that continuous monitoring that I talked about, where operators have to monitor for pre-production operations in the first 6 months. The rule would now require for operators that are in cumulatively impacted communities that they have to continue that monitoring for the life of the facility. There is an ability to kind of show that the monitoring is not showing any concerns. And so then you could cease the monitoring, but you have to petition the division to do so. So it will impact the oil and gas industry, the upstream industry specifically in that way. And then it will also impact any even upstream industry or other members of industry who would build projects above certain thresholds. So if they have a certain amount of emissions of either hazardous air pollutants or VOCs or NOx or PM 2.5, then they would have to be subject to these additional requirements, which could include enhanced modeling and source specific monitoring, or it could include contribution to the community monitoring fund that the division, that the air quality enterprise would be operating. And then they could be subject to the RACT requirements as well that Director Ogletree mentioned. Sorry, Patricia.
No, you're good. And I just want to, clarify something for that right now is industry, oil and gas, all the other industries get from the state to pollute our communities. So they're actively getting permits to pollute our community. So that's what we're talking about, because I know not everybody was up to date with all the fun AQCC hearings yesterday. And again, where are we going to see what's the recourse for our communities once we again have even more data and even more proof showing that our communities are being impacted?
Okay. That's a fair point. I mean, the permitting system, by definition, not just in Colorado, but nationwide and as sanctioned by the EPA, is to allow people to pollute if they have a permit. And then for regulation, would hope ratchet that down. So along that line, we have a reader question from Rick Casey that I guess Mike about the specific makeup of ozone. That the state can measure and other people can measure ozone, but it's more difficult to measure the actual precursors that go into ozone. Whether anything can be done about that, whether that makes a difference. And that, I guess, leads me to the question of you commenting on Governor Polis when he was opposing some legislation that would have really changed air permitting in Colorado, did direct the division and the Air Quality Control Commission to do more to control one of the precursors, which is nitrogen oxide, which is emitted both by transportation industry, but also heavily by the oil and gas. A lot more there. So can you tell us a little bit about Governor Polis's directive to the agency means for nitrogen oxide, in response to that, and then we can have Jennifer talk about what impact that will have on the industry.
Yeah, let me quickly start by answering the first question from the reader, which was ozone formation. So that's correct, right? So ozone formation, ozone is something we can measure directly, but it's not a tailpipe emission. So ozone is formed by the mixing of nitrogen oxides and VOCs, volatile organic compounds, in the presence of sunlight. So here in Colorado, one of the challenges we have is meteorological, in that the mountains kind of form like a barrier, and then we have the VOCs and the nitrogen oxide butting up against the mountains and then sitting there and forming ozone. So part of the challenge is the meteorological factors. And then in terms of ozone precursors and those reductions, that's a lot of what we do, right? We pass rules to limit ozone precursors, both nitrogen oxides as well as volatile organic compounds. And then getting to the second part of it, Michael. So Governor Polis's new goal and direction to the Air Pollution Control Division and the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, which recently changed its name, was to reduce at least by 30% by 2025 and 50% by 2030 for nitrogen oxide emissions. So those are pretty aggressive targets, and something we'll be working closely with the COGCC to make sure that we're hitting those targets and reducing those ozone precursors.
So Jennifer, is coming from development and production. So will you be able to meet that? And how will you go about doing that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I believe industry, will be able to meet it, at least on the, as I understand it, and that the governor, he's asking the AQCC to implement regulations that will figure out a way to meet it. I think that the focus is on the upstream sector, both from pre-production and production emissions. As I mentioned before, one of the pre-production emissions is drill rig engines and completion engines that are used during the hydraulic fracturing process. And so it's going to be, I don't know that we know how to do that yet, but we're working, in stakeholder process. I think I mentioned the myriad of stakeholder processes that the division and the RAC have initiated. One of those is for pre-production engine emissions, and to evaluate what's available. Is it, are there opportunities to electrify? Are there opportunities to use different, what they call tiered engines, which have different emissions profiles or less emitting emissions profiles? What are the abilities? And I think that that's still underway and being evaluated. I think there are, as always with industry, not everyone operates in exactly the same manner. And so we have to look at the different, we have to be able to be flexible to work to achieve the reductions in a way that everyone can meet, right? That different operators who have different assets, who have different relationships, that smaller operators can meet things the same way that larger operators can, and that sort of stuff. I think, again, I mentioned the small engine emissions. That's also would get NOx reductions. And I guess I would also just say there are a lot of rulemakings that have already happened on the books that are going to be achieving even more NOx reductions going forward. Some of those in the upstream sector, but some of them in oil and gas sector generally. For example, a significant engine rulemaking for larger engines was completed in 2020, and operators have been in the process of implementing those, reducing those emissions, and looking at a variety of things there. And there's also just a host, not again under the governor's letter, but for NOx reductions from the midstream sector. There's an evaluation on the midstream committee to try and see how you would reduce CO2, which will also sort of evaluation of that may impact NOx reductions as well. So one of the things that I just think is important to understand is all of these different regulations, whether it's methane or VOCs or NOx or CO2, many of them all have the same result in many cases of bringing down those precursors of ozone, such that you would be reducing, you'd be reducing the VOCs and the NOx in the atmosphere. But I do want to just say that, as Director Ogletree mentioned, formation of ozone is such a complex issue that it really isn't. It's very hard to tell that if you reduce it here, what the impact and where it's going to be. And so it isn't just that, reducing more oil and gas to the greatest extent possible. I mean, the way that our ozone is structured and where the contributions come from, we couldn't get there even by eliminating the oil and gas contribution entirely.
And I would acknowledge
Replying
that
to their-
I was just to mention, Patricia, that the state's statistics on this do show that when you break down where the ozone's coming from, a significant amount is natural or natural. So there's some natural created there from California industry, from Asian industry, from wildfire smoke that contributes to it. But also, counter argument to that, control what we can control, and that Colorado does have emissions that are under our control that contribute to ozone, and there are arguments that there is more to be done on that. So, Patricia, do you want to respond to what Jennifer just said?
Yeah. Overall, with the NOx rulemaking, because it has been a hot topic this legislative session, I do want to acknowledge that both the agency office really iced community members out of the state meetings for feedback for the ozone bill at the legislature and during this process rulemaking. And I want to get out there that we're not expected to have rulemaking on this for a year. Months and months and months, at least about 2 years out before any regulations are made, and Lord knows how much enforcement will actually be behind. About the fact that when it comes, I'm on the midstream committee. I'm one of the members of the midstream committee. So industry has the capability to do this. It just want to do it or not.
Hey, I just want to break in here. We got a message from the sports desk that the Nuggets game is tied 14-14. So you haven't missed anything. And we'll be back to the Nuggets game, but that's what you want to do the rest of the evening. I did want to switch over to a reader question from local environmental attorney as the pointed and reasonable for Michael first, I guess, on what does financially feasible mean? Asking people to study what equipment they could use and employ that is the best on the market at the time. Who decides what is financially feasible for them to do and still make a profit if that's their goal? And is that set in stone?
That's a good question. And unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that specific question. These different types of, racked or backed requirements are very specific terms. So those terms are very well defined. I'm sorry, I can't speak specifically as to how those are accounted for.
That's all right. Patricia, I was going to ask you to comment on that because you might argue that financially feasible and what's fair to people's health may not always be in alignment. So when you hear the feasible, what does that mean given your commentary on history of disproportionate impact?
Absolutely. I am at the United States of America in 2023. So by all means, I am one of the lowest paid kind of demographics in the country. But I just want to say, if I'm able to find funding to get and $500,000 to do stringent, super robust community air monitoring, I'm sure the industry can find a few pennies on their budgets and maybe not give their CEOs and all of their executives millions of dollars and focus on protecting communities, because they keep talking about how aggressive they want to be. But again, actions speak louder than words.
So before we go to some final statements or conversation with people, Jennifer, do you want to talk about what does the phrase financially feasible mean to the oil and gas?
Yeah, and I think the phrase that was used, for example, in the rulemaking today is what's called cost effective. So it relates to kind of what the cost per ton of reduction is, right? And so you're not just looking at this question of like, what is the overall cost? You do look at all of those pieces. You look at what the capital cost is, what the operational costs are, what the life of the equipment is going to be, right? And it's a really complex, to Director Ogletree's position, it's a really complex and pretty well-known analysis, but it looks at also the pollutants that will be reduced by that piece of equipment or that control or what it is that you're trying to do. And so the intent is that it looks at it and says, okay, and again, this is a well-known kind of framework that is done across the country at the EPA level, et cetera, of like, are the efforts that we're undertaking to get each one of these tons per year of reduction, is that what we would deem cost effective? And, Colorado in our ozone context has some of the highest cost effective numbers in the country. And, they have taken they've implemented rules that, maybe not in other places would have been deemed cost effective. And, they've been implementing them. And so I do think Colorado has taken a pretty rigorous position on that in ozone rulemakings. I think the cost effectiveness that was adopted today is a little bit, it falls into the same bucket, but we're going to have to see, because it's for pollutants where the area is not in non-attainment, which is when you usually do that kind of analysis. So
I'm still on the first page of reader questions out of about 4, in addition to my own questions. So I'm sorry we can't get deeper into all these topics tonight. Give you the chance to mention what you want people to take away from this conversation, or what you want them to be thinking about. And Michael, maybe you can go first in terms of talking about what the department is doing, or should be doing more to protect people during this ozone season and in the long term.
Yeah, I just want to make just one correction to Patricia's statement that we won't be revisiting ozone rules for a couple of years. We actually have, we'll be revisiting the SIT this fall, I believe in December, in front of the Air Quality Control Commission. For me, I grew up in California, Southern California in the 90s in the LA basin, where we had some of the worst air quality. It was 3 times higher than it is here in Colorado now. As a person of color, I've experienced racism and discrimination. And for me, a lot of the work that we've been doing since I've gotten here, increasing transparency, finding ways to reduce pollution. The rulemaking today was one that, I never thought would have been possible, trying to work directly in disproportionately communities to reduce pollution and make sure that we can be as protective as possible. So for me, thanks for having this opportunity to talk about a lot of the work we're doing, because it for me is personal. And, I really hope that people understand that we are doing as much as we can to reduce pollution and protect some of the most vulnerable residents in our state.
Thank you, Michael. Jennifer, do you have some things you would like people to take away from the conversation and what the industry is doing?
Yeah, thanks. I think that, I just want to kind of say that, industry, there are a lot of moving pieces. There is a lot of process. There's a lot of permitting. There is a lot of rigorous analysis at both the COGCC and at the Air Pollution Control Division of oil and gas facilities. Oil and gas facilities for the upstream sector have done enormous strides in the last several years of removing sources of pollution, removing storage tanks so that they pipe and don't have storage tank emissions, removing what are called pneumatic controllers, which often could actuate and release methane and VOCs when they actuate. Ultimately, many of the new facilities that are being built, particularly if they have access to electricity, have very low emissions profiles. And so industry has been at the forefront in Colorado and paving the way for industry in the rest of the nation in building and designing facilities in a way that eliminate, to Patricia's concern, eliminate many of the points of pollution. But and when they have ones that they can't eliminate, they do their best to control them in many cases, if that's possible. And so I think too, that notion too, and part of that, industry is also works with the division as well as environmental stakeholders and local governments. They come to the table. They are at every rulemaking. They're in all the stakeholder processes. Many of us don't sleep, and I know that that's the same true for everybody on this call. That we are working really hard to be present, but we'll try and make the regulations sort of the best that they can be.
Thank you, Jennifer. Patricia, what will you be working on? Would you like the listeners to push their politicians, push their regulators on in the coming years?
Yeah, I just want to appreciate Michael's experience. I know that he has done a lot of work, and that this job isn't easy. There's a lot of tough conversations that have to be had. But at the end of the day, what I heard from Michael and what I heard from Jennifer is like, it's not so bad now. And I'm gonna do the work that I'm doing because I want to leave a better Colorado than we have right now, for my son and my community. And at the end of the day, that's the reason that I'm doing this work. I'm sure that's the same reason that Michael's doing this work, but I can't say the same about Jennifer because this is an industry that's targeted me personally. And so, just think about it. At the end of the day, a lot of things happen because we don't say no enough. And so I'd really encourage the listeners, any opportunity that you have to say no, take your chance and say no, because we need to make as much noise as possible. We're running out of time. And that's really all I have to say.
Well, thank you to our great panel, Patricia Garcia-Nelson from Colorado GreenLatinos, head of the Air Pollution Control Division, for Jennifer Biever, who represents API Colorado and the oil and gas industry. Thank you for taking your time with the Colorado Sun tonight. And we encourage all of our viewers to keep watching coloradosun.com, where we every day, and subscribe to our Sunriser newsletter and also to our Temperature weekly newsletter, which talks about climate and health and where they intersect in Colorado. And we discuss these air pollution issues and other things like them every week. So thanks everybody for joining us. Nuggets and over to the game. Thanks again.